The academy gates were tall enough to make most humans feel small. Lily walked through them with a single bag over her shoulder and a printed schedule in her hand. She looked at the paper, then at the towering stone buildings around her, and folded the paper into her pocket. She had seen bigger. She had been in worse places. This was just school. The other students moved around her like water around a small rock. Most of them were twice her size. A Cretan student rolled his heavy shoulders as he passed, his gray skin catching the morning light. A pair of Velhari girls floated slightly above the ground as they talked to each other, their silver hair moving even though there was no wind. Nobody looked at Lily. Nobody stopped. She was simply too small and too plain to be interesting. She found her classroom on the second floor. Room 14. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was already half full. Long benches ran from one side to the other, and students sat in groups, talking loudly. The ceiling was high. The windows were wide. At the front of the room stood a tall board covered in strange diagrams and symbols. Lily looked at the empty seats and chose one near the back, by the window. She set her bag down, sat quietly, and looked outside at the courtyard below. Nobody greeted her. A large student named Drac dropped onto the bench 2 rows ahead. He was Cretan, with broad shoulders and a thick neck, and he carried himself the way students did when they had never been told no. He laughed at something his friend said and slapped the bench hard enough to shake the table. Several students around him laughed too. Not because it was funny. Because Drac laughed first. Across the room, a girl named Sarah sat with perfect posture. She was Velhari, slim and pale, with sharp eyes that moved slowly around the room the way a teacher's eyes do. She noticed Lily the moment Lily walked in. She looked at the plain bag, the simple clothes, the quiet way Lily sat down. Sarah leaned toward the girl beside her and said something low. The other girl glanced at Lily and smiled in a way that was not kind. Lily did not notice. Or if she did not show it. The professor arrived a few minutes later. His name was Vorn. He was old, even by Draven standards, and Draven lived for a very long time. His skin was deep brown and lined like old wood. He walked slowly but not weakly. There was a difference. He set a worn book on the front table, looked out at the class, and began without introduction. Interspecies relations. History and present, he said. You are here because your families believe education matters more than comfort. I agree with them. Open your books to page 40. There was a shuffling sound as students reached into bags. Lily reached into hers and pulled out a small, battered copy of the same textbook. It was older than the ones the other students had. The cover was creased and some of the pages had small notes written in the margins in neat, small handwriting. Her notes. From before. Vorn began the lesson. He spoke about the early contact period, about the first meetings between species, about the mistakes that were made and the ones that were avoided. He was a good teacher. He did not perform. He simply spoke clearly and expected the students to follow. Most of them did. A few did not bother. Drac leaned back on his bench and crossed his arms. He was not reading. He was watching the room the way students do when they are bored and looking for something more interesting than a lesson. His eyes moved across the rows and landed on Lily. He stared for a moment. She was reading, her finger moving slowly along a line of text. He looked at her bag. He looked at her clothes. He turned back to his friend and said something quietly. His friend looked at Lily too. They both looked away after a moment, uninterested. Humans were not interesting. Everyone at the academy knew that. They were the youngest species in the alliance, the softest, the slowest to heal, the weakest in strength. They lived short lives. They had no special abilities. Some people said it was kind that humans were allowed into an academy like this at all. Others said it was simply politics. Sarah thought it was politics. She did not say this out loud during class, but she thought it clearly and often. At the midpoint of the lesson, Bourne asked the class a question about the third contact period and waited. A few hands went up. He called on a student near the front. The answer was mostly correct. Bourne nodded and added to it. Then he looked toward the back of the room. He had been doing this since the lesson began. Not obviously. Not in a way the students would notice. But his eyes returned to the back corner again and again, to the small human girl sitting by the window with the old textbook. It was not her answers that caught his attention. She had not raised her hand once. It was the way she sat. Most students, even the good ones, shifted in their seats during a long lesson. They leaned forward, then back. They tapped their fingers. They looked out the window when they thought no one was watching. It was normal. It was human. Or rather, it was the behavior of any young person sitting in a room for a long stretch of time. Lily did not shift. She did not tap. She sat with both feet flat on the floor, her back straight but not stiff, her hands resting open on the desk. She was reading carefully. When Bourne spoke, she listened without looking up, as if she could do both things at once without effort. Bourne had taught for many decades. He had seen nervous students try to look calm. He had seen arrogant students try to look relaxed. He knew the difference between someone pretending to be still and someone who simply was. Lily simply was. She turned a page. Her eyes moved across the text. Outside the window, two birds crossed the sky above the courtyard, and for just a second her gaze lifted and followed them. Then it returned to the book. Bourne looked away and continued the lesson. When the bell rang, students stood and gathered their things loudly. Drac stretched his arms wide and yawned. Sarah closed her book with a soft snap and said something to the girl beside her. The room filled with voices and movement. Lily closed her textbook, placed it in her bag, and stood. She lifted the bag over one shoulder. She did not rush. She did not linger. She walked toward the door at the same pace she had walked through the academy gates that morning. Steady. Unhurried. Quiet. Bourne watched her go. He pulled his old book toward him and looked down at the open page, but he was not reading it. He was thinking about the way she had sat in that chair. The way she had breathed. The way her eyes had moved around the room once, just once, when she first walked in, quickly, carefully, taking everything in, and then never again. He had seen that kind of awareness before. A long time ago. In very different places. He tapped the edge of the book slowly with one finger. Interesting, he thought. Very interesting. 3 days passed quietly. Lily came to class each morning with her old textbook and her single bag. She sat in the same seat by the window. She listened to Bourne's lessons. She ate lunch alone at the end of a long table near the door, not because she was sad, but because it was a good seat. She could see the whole room from there. Old habit. The other students left her alone. That was fine. She was not there to make friends quickly. She was there to watch, to learn the rhythm of the place, and to understand who everyone was before anything else happened. She had learned, over many years, that something always happened eventually. On the 4th day, it started small. Drac came into the classroom that morning differently than usual. His steps were heavier. His jaw was set. He dropped onto his bench and stared at the front board without blinking. His friend sat beside him and said something quietly. Drac did not answer. A few minutes later, another large student walked in. His name was Gorn. He was not Creathian like Drac. He was Tharvan, a species built wide and low to the ground, with dark-plated skin and deep-set eyes. Gorn was not in this class often. He was supposed to be in the Advanced Combat Theory room 1 floor up. But today he walked into room 14 and stood near the door with his arms folded. He looked at Drac. Drac looked back. Lily noticed this from the back of the room. She turned a page in her textbook, but her eyes moved up just slightly, enough to see both of them without looking like she was watching. Vorn had not arrived yet. That was the problem with the next few minutes. There was no adult in the room. Sarah noticed the tension too. She sat up straighter and glanced between Drac and Gorn with narrow eyes. She did not look afraid. She looked annoyed, the way someone looks when they can see a mess about to happen and they do not want to be near it. Gorn walked forward slowly. He stopped a few rows from Drac and spoke in a low voice. "Your clan sent a message to mine," Gorn said. "Last night." Drac's eyes did not move. "My clan sends many messages. This one called our elder a coward." The room went quiet the way rooms do when everyone suddenly stops pretending not to listen. Drac stood up. He was tall. Gorn was wider. Neither of them looked like the kind of person who walked away from things easily. "Your elder ran from the border agreement," Drac said. "Everyone knows it. My clan simply said what others would not." Gorn's plated hands closed into fists. "You will ask your clan to take those words back." "I will not." It happened fast after that. Gorn moved first. He shoved Drac hard in the chest with both hands. Drac stumbled back into the bench, caught himself, and came forward with his shoulder low. The two of them collided in the middle of the room with a sound like two rocks hitting each other. Benches scraped. A stack of books fell. Someone screamed. Students scattered immediately. Chairs and benches were pushed back as everyone tried to get away from the two large bodies crashing into each other. A Velhari girl near the front pressed herself against the wall. Two smaller students ran for the door. Sarah stepped back quickly and pulled another girl with her, putting a bench between herself and the fight. The room was loud. Everyone was moving. Everyone except Lily. She stayed in her seat. She placed one hand flat on her textbook and watched. Her breathing was slow and even. Her eyes moved carefully across the room, not just at the fight, but at everything around it. The door. The windows. The position of every student. The distance between the fighters and the walls. The size of the space they were moving through. Drac grabbed Gorn by the front of his jacket and pulled. Gorn drove his elbow back and broke the grip. They spun together and crashed into a row of benches on the left side of the room. Wood cracked. A water bottle rolled across the floor. Students near the door pushed against each other trying to get out. The ones who could not get out pressed against the walls and watched with wide eyes. Some were shouting. Some were completely silent. Lily was silent. Her eyes moved to the right side of the room. Near the far window. There was a smaller student there, a young Velhari boy, probably a first year, who had been sitting quietly when everything started. He had not moved fast enough when the others scattered. Now he was pressed against the wall beside the window with nowhere to go, his back flat against the stone, watching the fight with wide, frightened eyes. Lily looked at him. Then she looked at the two fighters. They were moving again, turning, shoving. Their path was unpredictable. Big bodies in a closed room do not move in straight lines. They stumble. They spin. They fall sideways. She calculated this without thinking about it. It was just something she knew how to do. Drac caught Gorn with a hard push and Gorn went sideways. He crashed into a bench, spun off it, and his arm swung wide. The swing caught the edge of a desk and sent it sliding hard across the floor. The desk hit the wall just below the window where the small Velhari boy was standing. The boy flinched and jumped sideways. His feet slipped on something. He reached out for the window ledge to catch himself and his fingers caught the edge, but his body was leaning outward and the window behind him was open and the drop to the courtyard below was not small. He made a short, sharp sound. Not quite a scream. More like a breath that got cut off. And that was the moment. Something shifted in Lily's eyes. It was not panic. It was not anger. It was something quieter and much more focused than either of those things. Like a door opening in a very calm, very organized room. Like a switch being turned to a position it had been in many times before. She was already standing before the boy finished making that sound. Her bag stayed on the floor. Her textbook stayed on the desk. She moved out from behind the bench and into the open space of the room without hesitation, without hurry, and without any expression on her face except for one of complete and total attention. The fight was still happening. Drac and Gorn were still pushing and hitting. The room was still loud and frightened. Nobody had noticed Lily move yet. But Vorn, who had appeared silently in the doorway 30 seconds earlier and had been watching everything with old, steady eyes, noticed. He saw the shift in her posture. He saw the change in her eyes. He had been about to step in himself. Now he stopped. He stood very still in the doorway with his hand resting on the frame, and he watched the small human girl walk toward the center of a fight between two students who outweighed her by a very large amount. He did not look afraid for her. He looked like a man who had just had a long suspicion confirmed. Lily moved the way water moves around something in its path. Smooth. Quiet. Without wasted effort. She crossed the open space of the room in a few quick steps and reached the window ledge before the Velhari boy lost his grip. Her hand closed around his wrist firmly and she pulled him forward, away from the edge, and set him back on his feet on solid ground. She did not look at him when she did it. Her eyes were already on the two fighters behind her. The boy pressed himself against the wall and stared at her. She had already turned away. Drac and Gorn had not noticed her yet. They were too deep in it. Drac had Gorn by the shoulder and was trying to drive him into the wall. Gorn had his feet planted wide and was pushing back hard. Both of them were breathing heavily. Both of them were angry in the way that big, strong people get angry when they feel their honor is being questioned. It was a deep and serious kind of angry. The kind that does not cool down easily. Lily stepped into the space between them. Not beside them. Not near them. Between them. Right into the middle of it. Gorn saw her first. His eyes dropped down to her for just a second, confused, because nothing in his experience had prepared him for a small human girl walking calmly into the middle of a fight he was having. That second of confusion was enough. Lily's hand came up and pressed flat against Gorn's chest. She did not push hard. She did not need to. The pressure was placed in exactly the right spot, and she turned her body slightly as she applied it, and Gorn's momentum, which had been driving forward, suddenly had nowhere useful to go. He stumbled sideways, more surprised than hurt, and his grip on Drac broke. She was already turning toward Drac. Drac was faster than Gorn. He was also angrier, because the fight had started from something that had been sitting in his chest for longer than just this morning. He came forward with his shoulder and his weight behind it. Lily stepped to the side. Just enough. His shoulder passed her. She moved with it instead of against it, one hand on his forearm, guiding the force of his movement rather than trying to stop it. Drac was much bigger than her. Stopping him directly would have been foolish. Redirecting him was something else entirely. He stumbled forward and caught himself on a bench. He turned around, breathing hard, and looked at her. She was standing between him and Gorn, feet shoulder-width apart, completely still. She was not in a dramatic fighting pose. She was just standing. Calm. Present. Both hands loose at her sides. She looked at Drac the way someone looks at a problem they have already solved in their head and are simply waiting for the physical version to catch up. Drac had fought before. Many times. He was good at it and he knew it. But something about the way this small human girl was standing made him slow down in a way he could not immediately explain. Gorn came from the other side. He was not a thinker in moments like this. He was a pusher. He moved toward the space where Drac was and Lily was simply in the way. He reached for her shoulder to move her aside. She was not there when his hand arrived. She had shifted, small and precise, and his reaching arm was suddenly extended too far forward and off balance. Her hand closed around his wrist and she turned, using his own leaning weight, and brought his arm around behind his back in a lock that stopped him completely. She applied just enough pressure to make the joint ache without breaking anything. Gorn grunted and went still immediately because his body told him very clearly that moving would make things worse. She held him there. Drac stared. The room was silent. Students who had been pressed against walls and hiding behind benches were watching with open mouths. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were Gorn breathing through his nose and a distant bird outside the open window. Lily looked at Drac over Gorn's shoulder. She spoke for the first time since the fight began. Her voice was low and even. Not commanding. Not angry. Simply clear. "Step back," she said. "Please." It was the please that did something strange to the room. It was so ordinary. So calm. Like she was asking him to pass something at a table. Drac looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Gorn, held and still, and something moved behind his eyes. He took one step back. Then another. He straightened slowly and crossed his arms and looked away, which was as close to standing down as someone like Drac was going to get in front of an audience. Lily released Gorn's wrist carefully. She did not push him away. She simply let go and stepped back and gave him space to recover his dignity along with his balance. Gorn rolled his shoulders slowly and turned to face her. His expression was not friendly. But it was no longer the same kind of angry it had been a minute ago. It was something more complicated. Confused and wary and something else underneath that he probably could not name yet. She looked at him steadily. "It is done," she said simply. 2 words. Quiet as the rest. Gorn looked at Drac. Drac looked at the floor. Neither of them moved toward each other again. Lily turned and walked back to the small Velhari boy who was still standing against the wall near the window. She looked at him directly. He was shaking slightly, his pale face even paler than usual, his silver hair still. "Are you hurt?" she asked. He shook his head quickly. His eyes were very wide. "Good," she said. She nodded once. Then she walked back to her seat at the back of the room, sat down, and placed her hand back on her textbook. Nobody in the room spoke. Sarah stood near the front wall with her arms folded and her expression completely unreadable. She looked at Lily for a long time. Then she looked down at her own hands and said nothing. Drac stood in the middle of the room with his arms still crossed. He was staring at the back of Lily's head. He had never been stopped before. Not like that. Not quietly. Not by someone who did not even look like they were trying. It was a new feeling. He was not sure yet what to do with it. Vorn stepped fully into the room from the doorway. His footsteps were slow and deliberate on the stone floor. Every student in the room looked at him immediately. He looked around the classroom slowly. At the broken bench. At the scattered books. At Gorn and Drac standing apart. At the small Velhari boy against the wall. At Lily, sitting quietly in the back corner with her hand on her textbook as if she had simply been reading this whole time. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he moved to the front of the room, set his book on the table, and looked out at the class with old, steady eyes. "Sit down," he said quietly. "All of you." They sat. Every single one of them. Without argument. Without delay. Even Drac. The academy administrator's office was on the ground floor, at the end of a long corridor with stone walls and tall narrow windows. It was a serious room. Heavy desk. Old files on wooden shelves. A seal of the Interspecies Alliance mounted above the door in bronze. Administrator Holt sat behind the desk. He was a large man, older, with short gray hair and the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. He had been called up from his morning meeting because of what happened in room 14. He had arrived, looked at the broken bench, looked at the students, looked at Lily sitting calmly in the back corner, and said 4 words. My office. All involved. Now Drax sat on one side of the room. Gorn sat on the other. Lily sat in the middle, her bag on her lap, her hands folded on top of it. Vorn stood near the door with his arms behind his back. Holt looked at each of them in turn. Then he opened the file on his desk and began reading. He read for longer than anyone expected. His expression did not change much as he read. But once, about halfway through, he stopped. He looked up at Lily over the top of the file. She looked back at him evenly. He looked down again and kept reading. When he finished, he closed the file and set it on the desk and was quiet for a moment. Miss Lily, he said. Yes, she said. Your transfer documents list you as a standard academic placement from the Earth Regional Education Board. They do, she said. They do not mention, Holt continued slowly, that you hold a senior field certification from Earth's Peacekeeping Division. Or that you completed 4 active deployments before the age of 20. Or that you have been formally decorated twice for conduct in high-risk civilian situations. The room was very quiet. Drac turned his head and looked at Lily. Gorn did the same. Both of them said nothing. Lily looked at Holt calmly. Those documents were filed separately. Through a different channel. You would have received them eventually. I am receiving them now, Holt said. He turned the file around and slid it across the desk toward her. Would you like to explain the program? Lily looked at the file for a moment. Then she looked up. The Peacekeeping Division runs an interspecies youth safety program, she said. It places trained operatives inside academic institutions across the Alliance. Not as security. Not as staff. As students. The idea is that a trained person inside a student environment can respond to incidents faster than any external team. They can also observe the social patterns of young interspecies groups and report back on what is working and what is not. She paused. I was assigned here 6 weeks before the term began. The transfer documents were kept simple on purpose. The program works better when nobody knows. Holt looked at her for a long moment. And yet something happened today that made your cover considerably less simple. Lily nodded once. A student was in danger of falling. I made a decision. You stopped 2 fighters who outweigh you by a significant amount. Yes. Without injury to either of them. That was the goal. Holt sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back at her. I am not angry, Miss Lily. I want to be clear about that. I am simply recalibrating my understanding of who is sitting in my classrooms. Vorn made a small sound near the door. It might have been a laugh. It was difficult to tell. Holt looked at Drac and Gorn. The 2 of you will be dealt with separately regarding today's incident. Clan disputes do not belong in classrooms. You both understand this. Neither of them argued. That was new for Drac. Vorn noticed it. Drac was still looking at Lily. His expression was not the same as it had been in the classroom that morning, or in the days before, when he had glanced at her and looked away without interest. Now he was looking at her the way you look at something you thought you understood and have just discovered you did not understand at all. Gorn was quieter. He was staring at the floor. His plated hands rested on his knees and he turned them over slowly, thinking about something. The arm she had locked behind his back did not hurt anymore. But he remembered the feeling of being completely stopped. No pain. Just stillness. She had not wanted to hurt him. She had simply wanted him to stop. And somehow that was harder to sit with than if she had. They were dismissed one by one. Lily was asked to stay behind a few minutes longer while Holt made a quiet communication call to the peacekeeping division to confirm everything. She sat and waited without fidgeting. When she came out into the corridor, Sam was there. Sam was a human boy from her homeroom. Quiet, thin, with dark eyes and a habit of carrying too many books in his bag. He had been in the classroom when everything happened and had pressed himself against the far wall like the others. Now he was standing in the corridor with his bag over both shoulders, clearly waiting. He looked at her when she came out. "I knew," he said simply. Lily looked at him. "Knew what?" "That you were not just a student." He shifted the bag on his shoulders. "The way you sat. The way you watched the room. The way you ate lunch by the door every day." He paused. "My uncle was in the peacekeeping division. Ground team. I grew up watching him sit in restaurants with his back to the wall and his eyes on the exits." He looked at her carefully. "You do the same things." Lily was quiet for a moment. "You did not say anything." "No," Sam said. "It was not my place." He looked down at his shoes briefly. "Also, I figured if you were here, there was probably a good reason. And I thought maybe it was better for everyone if things stayed quiet." He looked up again. "Was I right?" "You were right," she said. He nodded. Then he adjusted his bag again and started walking down the corridor. After a few steps he stopped and turned back. "That thing you did with Gorn's arm," he said. "The lock. My uncle tried to teach me that once. I could never get it right." "It takes time," she said. He nodded again and walked away. Lily stood in the corridor alone for a moment. Down at the far end, through the tall narrow window, she could see the courtyard. Students were moving through it between lessons. Big ones and small ones. Loud ones and quiet ones. Different species walking the same ground, some of them fine with each other and some of them carrying old tensions the way Drac and Gorn had carried theirs into room 14 that morning. She watched them for a moment. Then she picked up her bag, straightened it on her shoulder, and walked back toward the stairs. There was still another lesson before the end of the day. The next morning Lily came to class the same way she always did. Single bag. Old textbook. Steady steps. She walked through the door of room 14 and moved toward the back of the room without looking at anyone. She was not performing confidence. She was not making a point. She simply moved the way she always moved, because nothing about who she was had changed overnight. But the room had changed. She noticed it immediately. She noticed most things immediately. The bench nearest the window, her bench, had been cleared completely. Not just the spot where she usually sat, but the whole row. 3 students who normally spread their bags and books across that entire bench had moved without being asked. They were sitting closer together on the bench in front, leaving the back row open. For her. Lily stopped for just a second. Then she walked to her seat and sat down. Nobody said anything about it. Nobody made it into a moment. It simply was what it was. She set her textbook on the desk and opened it to the right page and waited for the lesson to begin. A Velhari girl who sat 2 rows ahead turned around briefly. She did not speak. She just looked at Lily for a moment with something serious and respectful in her eyes. Then she turned back. That was all. It was enough. Drac came in a few minutes later. He looked different from the day before. Not smaller. He was still large and broad and carried himself with the same physical weight. But something around his eyes was quieter. He sat down and for once did not immediately start talking to the student beside him. He set his book on the desk and looked at it. Halfway through the lesson, when Vorn paused to let the class copy a diagram from the board, Drac turned around in his seat and looked at Lily. She met his eyes. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I want to learn that." Lily looked at him. "Learn what?" "What you did," he said. "The way you moved. The way you stopped it without making it worse." He paused and his jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in the way it does when someone is saying something that costs them a little pride. "I have been trained to fight. I have not been trained to stop one." Lily looked at him for a long moment. "There is a difference," she said. "I know that now," he said. She considered him carefully. Not his size or his strength. Those were obvious. She was considering the thing behind his eyes. Whether it was real. Whether the humility was genuine or just temporary embarrassment looking for a way to turn itself back into confidence through a different door. It looked real. "After lessons," she said. "Courtyard. I will show you the basics." Drac nodded once. He turned back to the board and picked up his pen and began copying the diagram. He did not smile or make it into anything larger than it was. Lily appreciated that. She turned back to her own book. The lesson continued. Near the end, when Vorn was summarizing the key points of the session, Lily became aware of someone moving along the row toward her from the left. She did not turn her head. She tracked it in her peripheral vision out of habit. It was Sarah. Sarah sat down on the bench one space away from Lily. She set her book on her lap and looked at the front of the room as if she had simply moved seats for a practical reason. Her posture was perfect as always. Her expression was composed as always. For a moment she said nothing. Then, still looking at the front of the room, she spoke in a voice low enough that only Lily could hear. "I said something unkind about you on your first day," Sarah said. "When you walked in. I said it to the girl beside me." A short pause. "You probably did not hear it." "I heard it," Lily said. Sarah was quiet for a second. "I thought so." Another pause. "I was wrong about you. I made a judgment before I had any basis for one." She turned her head and looked at Lily directly. Her sharp eyes were steady. There was no performance in them. "I am sorry for that." Lily looked back at her. Sarah was not a person who apologized easily. That was clear from everything about her, from the way she held herself to the way she chose every word carefully. This apology had cost her something real. "Accepted," Lily said simply. Sarah held her gaze for one more moment. Then she gave a small nod, picked up her book, and moved back to her original seat before the lesson ended. Clean. Uncomplicated. Done. Lily looked back at the board. When the bell rang and the room emptied, Lily stayed behind to gather her things slowly. She was in no rush. The courtyard session with Drac was not for another hour. She had time. She was sliding her textbook into her bag when she heard footsteps approaching. Slow ones. Deliberate. She knew that particular rhythm already. Vorn stopped beside her bench and stood with his hands behind his back. He looked out the window at the courtyard below for a moment. The afternoon light was coming in at a low angle and it caught the lines on his face and made him look even older than usual. But not tired. Never tired. "I owe you a small confession," he said. Lily looked at him and waited. "I knew," he said. "From the first day. From the first minute, if I am being precise." He kept looking out the window. "The way you entered the room. The single assessment sweep of the space before you sat down. The way you positioned yourself with sight lines to both the door and the window." He paused. "I have lived a long time. I have seen that kind of awareness before. In very specific kinds of people. Lily was quiet for a moment. You did not report it. No, he said. Why? He turned from the window and looked at her. His old eyes were calm and clear. Because whatever your reason for being here, you were clearly not a danger. And because I was curious. A small pause. I wanted to see what you would do when something happened. I suspected it would be instructive. Was it? She asked. Very, he said. He looked at her for a moment longer. You showed 30 young students, from 6 different species, something that I have spent 40 years trying to teach them in this room. He gestured at the empty benches around them. That strength used without wisdom is just noise. And that the quietest person in the room is not always the smallest. Lily looked at the empty room around her. The cleared bench near the window. The faint marks on the floor where the benches had been shoved during the fight. The afternoon light sitting still and gold on everything. She thought about why she had come here. Not the official reason in the program documents. The real one. The one she carried quietly the way she carried everything, close and without show. She had come because she believed that the place where different species learned to sit in the same room was also the place where they learned whether they could trust each other. And that what happened in those rooms, in those ordinary unremarkable moments between lessons and arguments and small daily choices, mattered more than anyone in an office building usually wanted to admit. She had come because someone had to sit in the back and watch. And step in when it counted. And then sit back down again like nothing had happened. Lily picked up her bag and settled it over her shoulder. And then, quietly, she smiled. It was a small smile. Genuine. The kind that does not need an audience. Thank you, Professor, she said. Vorn gave a slow nod. He turned and walked toward the door at his usual unhurried pace. At the doorway he stopped without turning around. The boy, he said. The Velhari student from the window. His name is Pip. He has been asking the other students who you are since yesterday. A brief pause. I believe he would like to thank you himself. He walked out. Lily stood alone in the quiet classroom for a moment. Then she walked to the door, stepped out into the corridor, and headed toward the courtyard stairs. She had work to do.